Our next session this morning is titled Good Fire, Bad Fire, Reintegrating Fire into the Landscape. We're really grateful to be joined by two experts in this field this morning. First of all, presenting to us remotely from the Indigenous Leadership Initiative is Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen. And joining us in the room here, we're really glad to have him with us from the Secwepemc in BC, a firekeeper, Joe Gilchrist. So I'm going to hand over to Joe, first of all, just briefly in the room, and we'll hear from Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen as well. Joe.
Hello, everybody. Joe Gilchrist from Skeetchesen, the Secwepemc Nation. I grew up using fire since I was very young. And I also started firefighting when I was 15 years old. We used fire on our traditional territory for many different reasons, for our medicine, for our animals, and to cook and clean. And if you look after the land will look after you. And I just don't want to take up too much time of Amy's. Amy's going to present for 20 minutes, and then I'll present 20 minutes after her, and then we'll have questions. So I'll give it over to Amy.
Thanks, Joe. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person today. I have two young kids, and so I try to limit my travel a little bit for work. But I wish I could be there and meeting you all, and I'm so happy that Joe's there. And so I'm going to present today on the work that we're doing nationally on Indigenous fire stewardship. And so I'll explain what that is in a minute. And so our title is Good Fire, Bad Fire, Reintegrating Fire into the Landscape. But I just want to make it clear that there's, it's kind of a catchy term, the good fire, bad fire, but obviously fire is on a spectrum, and fire, things we might consider bad fires can also have good impacts. So, but I'll get into that as we go here. So just about me. So I'm a Cree Métis woman. My family is from the disenfranchised Piécis band that was disenfranchised after the Louis Riel resistance that happened in, so we're from northern Alberta, and the other side of my family is from the Labachan settlement. So these are some of my my grandma and her brothers and sisters there. And so they were a group of Métis buffalo hunters that came across. So we've had fire in our lives for a while. They were trappers, and so a lot of the work they did after buffalo hunting was in trapping, where they used fire. And so I was disconnected for fire for part of my life, but have come back in my 30s and am learning to be a cultural fire practitioner. So just to give you an example of why this work is important, when I worked for the Canadian Forest Service for about 14 years as a research scientist there, we documented wildland fire evacuations across Canada for a 42-year period. And so just to show you that evacuations occur all over. We don't have 2023 on here. This paper was published before then, but obviously that had a huge impact in the Northwest Territories. But what's really important to point out here is that the orange dots are evacuations of Indigenous communities across Canada. So communities that have greater than 50% Indigenous population. And as you can see, there's huge impacts on Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast across what we now call Canada. So even though Indigenous people make up about 5% of the Canadian population, about 42% of wildfire evacuation events during that period were of Indigenous communities. So again, we're disproportionately impacted, but often kept out of wildland fire decision-making. And this here, just pay attention to like the big numbers there. This just shows repeat evacuations of communities. So during that 42-year period, some of these communities were evacuated between 5 and 7 times for wildland fire events. So all different events. And all of those, except for one of those 14, are Indigenous communities. So again, really just showing that our communities repeatedly face issues with out of control wildfire. One really interesting thing to look at is, what causes wildfire evacuations. So in Canada, amongst the general Canadian population, the direct threat of fire. So, when a fire is nearing a community really causes the most evacuations, so 78%. Whereas smoke only evacuations, so where there's no threat from fire, but there's significant air quality issues, are about 17% of evacuations. And when we look at Indigenous communities, about 60% are direct threat, but we really see the smoke numbers go way up. And a lot of that is because of access to communities, and that many Indigenous communities rely on aircraft or single roads or other things to get access to and from their communities. So I'm part of the group called the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, and we worked with 7 different First Nations across Canada to interview over 200 Indigenous people who'd experienced evacuation, and came up with this book, First Nations Wildfire Evacuations. And so every chapter goes through a different stage of the evacuation process, from when people first see fire, a smoke column on the horizon, to getting evacuated, going to a host community, staying there, and repatriating home. And then even, long after the evacuation, because I think that's one thing that we don't really note, is that a lot of times that the impacts don't end when people get to go home to their community. Many people, 2, 3, 5 years later are still traumatized from their evacuation experiences. So this book kind of goes through, and at the end of every chapter, there are recommendations both for Indigenous communities and also agencies that work with Indigenous communities on how to make evacuations better experiences when they're needed. So again, we have increasing risk. This is just a GIF of the Elephant Hill fire in British Columbia, just showing that the fire is spreading. And so this is all their Indigenous territory, and there was a high severity, high intensity wildfire that impacted soils and other things, and their community is still recovering from this 2017 fire that went through. So lots of the press, blames climate change, but we also have fire exclusion, which I'm going to get into more, fire suppression of fires from ecosystems that depend on them, current forest management practices, expanding communities. And then about 60% of First Nation reserves are actually located within or intersect what we deem in wildfire the wildland-human interface. So basically, where fuels, where vegetation mixes with people and their structures. So what is Indigenous fire stewardship? So we've defined this as any activity where Indigenous peoples assert their jurisdiction and their rights related to fire. And so this is not only cultural burning, although lots of people talk about that, and I'm going to get into that as well. But this can also be, having your own firefighting crews, being in the EOC, like the Emergency Operations Center, when fires are happening. It can be, the work on revitalization and recovery after fires have gone through. It can be, just having a say in where thinning and other fuel treatments happen. So it's a very broad definition. So Indigenous cultural burning. So lots of people around the world internationally have sought to replace what we call fires of chance with fires of choice. So instead of waiting for those lightning strikes and other things, people would go out and decide where and when to set fire to certain landscapes, and they used fire to achieve specific cultural objectives. And so one of the elders from Northern Alberta, who was interviewed in 1979 by Henry Lewis, said, "I didn't set the forest on fire just for the, sorry, I can't see it on my screen, just for the burning, but so that I could return to here next year and live." And so I think on the left side is a Indigenous people, so Blackfoot, demonstrating a prairie fire start that they used to use for their buffalo hunts. And on the bottom right is a Cree Métis cultural burn in Cumberland House in Saskatchewan. And so I just want to address too, I know that, sometimes there's controversy amongst nations saying, we didn't do that, or we don't remember doing that, or we don't have the current knowledge to be able to put fire on the landscape. But I think one thing, to make so people understand is that, it's why I refer to it as Indigenous cultural burning and not traditional cultural burning, because anytime, you know, fire can be used and can help you on your landscape to achieve cultural objectives, like you can develop a cultural fire program. And if you think it's going to help reduce risk around your community, like there's no reason why nations can't, you know, either revitalize an old cultural fire program or start a new one. So Indigenous knowledge systems through research have been really shown to steward biodiversity. There's been a million, or not a million, but a lot of academic studies on that, we provide nature-based solutions to climate change, and also that our practices help with disaster risk reduction. So one way in cultural burning this happens is that, you know, by putting these fires of choice on the landscape, we're actually reducing vegetation that's there to burn in those hotter, drier summer months. And another thing I get lots is, you know, well, the boreal forest is huge. You couldn't have burned and managed it all. But the cultural burning that nations did was very strategic. A lot of it was around communities or in areas that were used by the community. And then we also depended on lightning as, you know, a really good ally. So our relative, our teacher, and, you know, we would also depend on those lightning fires that happened as well. So, you know, we went through this period of cultural severance with colonization where, you know, fires were excluded from our landscape. So people that came over brought with them these ideas that, you know, we shouldn't have fire. They basically racialized light burning and delegitimized or erased Indigenous people. And so there were three key narratives that happened through. So discrediting our knowledge, downplaying our knowledge, and then the third one is, sorry, just an erasure. So erasing our knowledge and saying that we didn't exist. But I think, you know, what we're seeing now with the current fire climate is that Indigenous people, you know, had a good idea of how to manage the forest and how to live on it successfully compared to trying to take European practices and apply them to Canada. So this paper I wrote with colleagues called Centering Indigenous Voices, the Role of Fire in the Boreal Forest. And I think one thing I want to point out from this is, you know, there's a lot of tree ring studies and other things that happen, or, you know, studies that Western scientists do of our nations and our territories. But this paper totally focuses on Indigenous perspectives only. So we, you know, that was really what we wanted to highlight in this paper, and just the knowledge of Indigenous people across the landscape. And so we have a table in there, and there's over 36 species in there that are known to have been managed with Indigenous burning practices in the Boreal. And so it goes through, you know, what they are, and then their location, and then the reasons for burning for each of those kind of cultural species there. And so again, one of my issues with the tree ring studies and other things is that a lot of times they miss cultural burning. Like I burn on our land and we don't scar trees where we burn, and we don't put up enough, you know, ash or anything to create a carbon layer on the soil. And so I often worry when we just rely on those studies to kind of bring back our practices that, you know, we're missing a lot of burning that actually occurred on the land. So this here is just an example again of a landscape. So on the top is, you know, what pre-colonization, pre-settlement, what the landscape would have looked like more in the Boreal Forest. So you've got like interspaced trees, a bunch of different species. You've got, you know, deciduous and coniferous and all sorts of grasslands mixed in there as well. You have these fires starting on the landscape, but because of the openness of the vegetation, they can kind of get rolling, like what we see with the fires now, where they really gain in intensity. On the bottom, you know, that's when fire suppression or the middle, sorry, is fire suppression starting. And so you can see anything that happened, you know, fires were put out on the landscape. And what we see is really an overgrowth and almost a tendency towards a monoculture forest. So an old, you know, forest with lots of coniferous trees that's very prone to burning and these huge fires. And again, this is just a real life. So we can look at historical photos and we see this happening all over Canada. So this is in British Columbia, and, you know, the top is that kind of open landscape. You can see through to the forest floor. The middle is, you know, when we're seeing a lot of trees, and then the bottom is the fire came through and has basically tried to put conditions back to that upper one. So another question that I get a lot is, what is the difference between cultural burning and prescribed fire? We often really conflate the two terms in Canada. And so working with a bunch of Indigenous Fire Circle folks, including Joe and others, we really went through and tried to define, the difference between the two terms. So I'm not going to get as much because we don't have enough time, but Indigenous cultural fire is led around cultural objectives. Has spiritual and ceremonial aspects. It's Indigenous knowledge driven around the time to burn and techniques for burning. Generally, it's slow, cool burns, fires we can walk beside is what we call it. And it follows traditional governance in our communities. Ignition generally using traditional methods, and that's because with drip torches and other accelerants, they introduce other fuels and chemicals to the landscape, which isn't great for growing medicinal plants. And it's about living with the land. So prescribed fire, it's more paramilitary. It varies in intensity, including crown fires, production burning. They try to do as much in as little time as possible. It's a job for many people, and ignition using accelerants too. So in the end here, before I pass it to Joe, I'm just going to go through some resources that people can look up. So one is the Blazing the Trail book. That's a product of Fire Smart Canada. So we wrote that one with 10 other Indigenous co-authors. And really it goes through, what is Indigenous fire, what communities across Canada are doing to reduce fire risk to their communities, including 11 different case studies. And there's all sorts of figures in there and other things that may be quite a bit of interest, as well as a bunch of different Indigenous art about people's perception of fire. We also have a study on the cultural safety of Indigenous wildland firefighters. So Indigenous wildland or Indigenous people, we make up a predominant amount of firefighters in Canada, especially pre-1990, yet there's a lot of racism and other things that occur on the fire line. And in this study, we found that of all the firefighters who participated, about 70% had experienced racism, harassment, or discrimination on the fire line. And so this kind of documents those cases so that we can start moving forward, including that Indigenous people also have a lot of close calls as well. And so we're continuing to work on this study to make safer spaces for Indigenous people and more opportunities for career development. The Thunderbird Collective is another group that's starting up. So this is a national Indigenous fire group. We have a steering committee, we have funding that we've received. And in this group, we're going to be looking at, advocacy, land-based learning, and knowledge sharing about Indigenous fire stewardship. And so pretty soon we're going to have a web page. If you go to that link right now, it's just under construction. But if you want more info, we do have an active email there. Joe's one of the elders on our steering committee and has been great. We're hiring right now a social media coordinator and project managers. And so we're really excited. And one of our big things that we're going to be doing is the first national Indigenous fire camp this fall. And so if people are interested, again, just let us know. It is fully funded for people to come down that want to participate. And it'll be just a gathering with Indigenous people who are interested and passionate about fire. I'll skip that one there. So We Are Fire is another really great resource for folks. So the website is wearefire.ca. And it's this is what you see when you go to that page. And it's a toolkit for applying Indigenous-led fire practices in the Saskatchewan River Delta. And one of the coolest things about the website is that the entire website is translated into Cree. And if you click on Listen to Cree on here, you'll hear the Cree audio come through. And so people, that you have a difficult time reading and other things, they can just listen to the website and all the information. And on the side, you can see how the community is moving forward to engaging in Indigenous-led fire prescriptions in their region. And this is another one we've just finished, and Joe helped with this one too. So Creating a Cultural Burn Pathway from Your Community is a booklet that we're releasing with FNESS, First Nations Emergency Services Society. It'll be released this summer. And so it's basically contains 7 worksheets that walk a community through building a burn plan for their nation. And so, yeah, I'll pass it to you, Joe, there. I think I'm right on the 20 minutes, so. And Joe, just let me know when you want your slides advanced.
Okay, yeah. For a slide advance, you said? Okay. Yeah, okay. So Joe Gilchrist from Skeetchison, the Northern Sonoran Desert. We have rattlesnakes, we have sagebrush, like you could see, juniper. We also have lodgepole pine, spruce, fir. We have cottonwood. We have all kinds of things that battle each other. What I mean by they battle each other, they battle each other chemically. They want to take over the land, as much land as they can take. So for thousands of years, indigenous people used fire because the indigenous people had hunting areas, had berry picking areas, medicine where medicine grows, all different reasons for the land providing for us and giving us life. And the common thing there was the use of fire. Indigenous people used fire early in the springtime when the snow left, and just around before the buds come out on the trees and stuff like that. You could burn really lightly, like Amy was saying, and you don't damage the deciduous trees and things like that, and you actually improve. You give nutrients to the ground for the grass and everything else to grow and to flourish. Your medicine is better. Your berries are bigger and better. Another time that people used fire would be in the fall time. They would wait till the summer was over, and then there was a rain, and then about a week, just let the rain soak down, and where the rain goes into the roots, that's going to stop the damage to the roots because it's moist, and then you burn lightly on top. Usually burn in the morning or you burn in the afternoon, and those burns are mostly like for huckleberries. For we call it hushum or soapberry. It's good for all the berries, pretty much the like raspberries and strawberries, things like that, and that knowledge of using fire. When you look at the whole landscape, like all indigenous people down there, I've been lucky enough. I've traveled now to Australia, and I've also met people from California in the U.S. And when I was in Australia, I met people from Fiji and Colombia. What's it? Colombia? Anyways, I can't remember the name, but so they're in South America, and it's the same. Indigenous people used fire all around the world for the same reasons. The countries are different, the climates are different, but the common thing is that Native people have lived on the land's provided them food, and the common thing is that fire was used to change the landscape to how we needed it to provide for us, our families, and our loved ones. As you can see, this is the picture here is with Tristan Evans from Australia, Indigenous person that they use fire on their land also. And I've got to know him and Ollie and Rachel from Australia, and the more I travel there, the more people I get to know, and I'm really interested in the interior and the northern parts of Australia, how they used fire, because where I'm from is a desert area, which is really hot and dry. Our temperatures get up, well, man, with climate change, 50 degrees Celsius, and it used to be, plus 30 Celsius to minus 30 Celsius, but now we're seeing colder colds and hotter hots, and our storms are getting more intense and our winds are getting more intense with climate change. And the only thing that we as human beings can change is the fuel that's on the ground. And we see that our firefighting budgets are getting really big, response to fires, things like that. And the one thing that Native people would say is there's a better way to spend your money, and the better way is Indigenous knowledge, how Indigenous people use the land. So where I'm heading is that if you burn early in the spring and early in the fall, you get rid of the fuels, and you open up the land, and it doesn't eliminate fires, but it'll slow them down. It'll make them so that the firefighters have a safe place to fight fires from. But also, if you burn at different times, like if you're burning for berries, you burn every 4 years. If you're burning for a hunting area where it's grassland, meadow, you burn every 2 years. And if you're burning for deciduous trees and that kind of a terrain, you burn every 4 years. So what you're doing is you're creating a mosaic of different fuels, a mosaic of different age classes of trees, different fuel types, so that the fire doesn't have a chance to be one giant fire that sweeps through and burns everything. It hits these different pockets of fuel, and there's more chances for firefighters to actually fight the fire. When I was a kid, I'm 58 now, and there never was a time when I was young where we were evacuated from fire or from smoke. And that was the ending of our ancestors burning. They weren't allowed to burn in the 1900s. The burning stopped, and those burn cycles. If you burned every 2 years, that's a burn cycle. That'd be done thousands and thousands of years. Every 2 years, it was burned. The matriarchs of our society kept that in their head, and where to move to next, and what berries, what plants, what medicines were becoming healthy because it was burned, so many years ago that we have to let this area rest. So now we're moving over here because we burned that so long ago, and now it's getting healthy and we could live there for a while. Then as we leave this area, we're going to burn this area, and then we'll come back. We'll just move and work with the land, be on the land, right? And so that way of thinking, and I'll get more into it later, is the 7-generational land management that Indigenous people have used for thousands of years. This 7-generational thinking is, you look back at the stories and the songs from your land, and you take that knowledge for today, and you see what's going on now. Well, of course, we're not allowed to use fire like we did before. And then you look into the future, and you say, well, if I don't do this and I don't do that, what am I handing to the next generation that's coming? The generation that's coming for them, and then the ones that aren't even born yet, the ones that can't speak. What are we going to hand to those ones that aren't even here yet? And so we as Indigenous people, need to look back and see how the land was used and how fire was a part of it, and look at why right now the fires are so big. And our smoke from our fires in British Columbia and Northwest Territories, Alberta, affected the countries in Europe. You know, there was so much smoke in New York and Philadelphia, Boston, all those areas that they pretty much couldn't go out of their houses, and it really bothered them. Was never like a case before. But now with climate change and these burn cycles that are missed, if you miss one burn cycle in grassland, then that gives a chance for, say, black spruce or lodgepole pine to start to grow. And then once it starts to grow, if you try to bring fire back, it's already gone beyond the height of the burn in the springtime. So now you can't kill those trees. They just start to take over. That's called encroachment. So encroachment on the land from a species that we don't want as Indigenous people. You know, it's natural. The black spruce, the lodgepole pine is a natural thing that grows around here, but not in places that we don't want it to be. If our area is for hunting and black spruce is taken over, well, the chemical that it drops suppresses the food for the animals, right? So, and our medicine and everything else. Oh, yeah, thanks. Kind of lost my thing now. Yeah, okay. So I guess I'm going to get back to the encroachment part and the budget kind of thing, because what I'm trying to say is that the wildland, like for Indigenous people, the wildland, if you talk spiritually, was a place where the elders say, don't go there because, you know, there's bad spirit or there's something going on in this area. Don't go to that area. And it was a small part of the traditional territory, but all the other land, you know, was healthy and productive, and, you know, like I was saying, you know, moved around, did other things, but there was areas that you couldn't go to. Those were the wildlands. Now, as soon as you walk out of the house and it's not a manicured lawn, it's not pavement or asphalt or concrete, it's wildland. You know, it's susceptible to wildfire. So the traditional and the spiritual way is that if you don't burn the land, you don't look after it, there's a balance between darkness and light. There's a balance of good and bad. And if you don't burn, then you get wood ticks, you get spiders, you get mice, you get all these things that Indigenous people see as bad, like omens are bad, spiritual things that take over the land, and the forest becomes denser and more shady and darker and less productive and things like that. And also, if you miss those burn cycles, then those forests die and they fall down. And if it's not a rainy part of the country, and then it just waits. It'll wait there for a fire, and it'll just keep falling. It'll just keep building up, and the fuel builds up, and it just keeps growing. And then what you get is catastrophic wildfire, and climate change is making that worse. So that's one reason why we're seeing worse fire seasons. And the one way to mitigate all the money that we're putting into suppression and response is prevention and wildfire mitigation, using Indigenous cultural burning in the springtime and the fall time. And in the wintertime, you can pile and burn and that kind of stuff too. And I think that's it. That's good. Good time. Good timing. I don't even know. I'll check my.
Great, Joe.
Okay. Oh, perfect.
Joe, you got plenty of time. Do you want to? We could take some questions?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Does anyone in the room have questions for Joe or for Amy? I got one at the back over here.
I think, sorry, we had just one more thing to share
Sure.
before. Yeah, so just issues about, lots of times when Joe speaks and others, like people just say like, well, why aren't we just doing this? Like it makes good common sense. With ILI, Indigenous Leadership Initiative, we are a national Indigenous-led conservation group, and we focus on guardian programs and Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And one of the big things we're advocating for now is the establishment of Indigenous fire guardian programs, where Indigenous people are employed year-round in fire in their communities. But it's difficult again, like, well, why don't we just get like, why aren't people interested in that? But we still really have a low recognition of Indigenous expertise related to fire. We're still here in many areas, and lots of times we hear that our knowledge isn't applicable to today, but we experience climate change all the time. We know that we can't just go set a cultural fire in the forest right now like we used to 100 years ago. That there's thinning or other things that need to be done first. There's power dynamics, including Indigenous sovereignty and land back. So lots of times when we think that like I had this in BC where they were giving permission basically for a nation to burn on territory that wasn't part of their reserve, but then that's basically like a proclamation of that territory, of that Indigenous people that the government's recognizing. So they're very nervous to give us permission to do things like that. There's also a lot of non-Indigenous interest and appropriation of burning. And our knowledge. Agencies oftentimes just want to roll it into their pre-existing programs. There's no sustained funding for jobs for Indigenous people. Lots of seasonal positions, but again, those are often contract or just a few weeks. There's one-off projects, so we get money to do one burn, one thinning, one other thing, but like Joe talked about, we really need those intervals of burning, and then we get overwhelming requests. Joe travels all over, like he said, because there's just so many people interested in this topic, but we don't really have capacity to keep building up our capacity as Indigenous people. And then in the end, it comes down to really a social justice issue, that fire was taken away from us. And so we should be the ones who are able to lead in where we want to put it back. So sorry, that was our last concluding slide there.
No worries. Thank you, Amy, for that. If you're asking questions, maybe just introduce yourself to our panelists so they have a sense of who you are and where you're coming from. We got a question here.
Hi, Joe. It's been within the last 100 years that we worked together. Good to see you again. Good presentation. I have a question in regards to the government in Northwest Territories continuously throws these two words at us when we want to do prescribed burn, which we've done historically in the past. And I'm wondering if you run across it in BC and everywhere else. It's called litigation and liability. They seem to want to hinder us from doing what we do culturally and traditionally. I'm curious, do you run across that in BC too?
Yeah, for sure. Like I was saying, we're not allowed to burn off of the Indian Reserve. If we burn off the Indian Reserve, we need to have a prescription. We need to go through, it's a 3 to 5 year process to put fire on the ground. And if you try to plan a fire 3 to 5 years from now, which day are you going to pick? Are you going to pick the most sunniest day? Of course, you're going to try to pick the sunniest day, but then it's going to be rainy that day, and you're going to have thousands of dollars worth of resources waiting to do the fire. And so if you have that much money invested in that day that you picked to burn, and it's not a good burn day, you're going to force your burn, and it's not going to be the way that you want it. Culturally, burning means that you're on the land and you know that it's a good day to burn. You could pick up the grass and you could feel that it's crunchy. You could kick the ground and you could see that the ground is still wet, deep underground. So you're not going to damage the tree, the roots and stuff like that. So yeah, the mitigation and the liability and things like that are getting better in BC. The Wildfire Act says that the government will help Indigenous people do burns now, which is kind of what we did back in the 90s and things like that. But now it's coming back again. So, but still, I think more change needs to come in legislation to allow Indigenous people to steward the land, to use fire on the land the way that we know that it should be done. And of course, science is always good and everything else, but when things need to burn, and it's a good time to burn a piece. And when I say a piece of land, I mean like maybe hundreds of thousands of hectares. Or, in BC, the Merritt Fire Zone where I'm from is 14 million hectares. So if you burn 20,000 hectares or 200,000 hectares every 7 years, and then you can have a rotation in the Ponderosa Pine, which is Ponderosa Pine burns every 7 to 15 years. So, and that's just one small part. That's just the Merritt Fire Zone. Large pieces of land was burned for different reasons, and legislation and policies need to change for governments to let Indigenous people steward the land using fire.
Can I just add, sorry, to the liability piece there? It's a great question, and honestly, it's probably the first one I get almost every time is about the liability issue. And so, there are Indigenous knowledge holders that Joe and I have learned from who say, that we don't have a word for liability in our languages. It's a responsibility is what we use. But in this, context this day, it doesn't really matter. There's agencies will often use that to take people off of putting fire, but there's ways we can address that. So Joe, for example, has individual liability insurance for burning. On my property, where we have a cultural burn site, we have farm liability insurance that applies. There's what we're looking to do with the Guardian Fire programs is that each Guardian program would also come with funding to purchase liability insurance as well. We're looking to develop liability funds, similar to what they've done in California, working with agencies as well, to potentially add, it's interesting to me because I worked for Parks Canada for years, and, we give liability protection to like an 18 or 19-year-old kid with a drip torch, but we don't to like a cultural fire practitioner that's also doing good work on the landscape. So we really need to look and start addressing these issues. So we are working on it, but it is a very complex system. In Australia, they're actually working, one of the biggest funders of cultural burns is insurance industries, who then provide them with liability insurance. So again, another way that we can potentially go in Canada. And the Thunderbird Collective, that's one of our items that we're going to be working on over the next year.
Thank you, Amy. Any more questions in the room? I've got one down here. Here we go.
Hi there. I'm Stephen Van Duyn. I'm the city manager for the City of Yellowknife, and very new to this space, and learning a lot, and very appreciative of the amount of effort that has gone into organizing these few days, and your presentations today have been very eye-opening. There's a lot of information that you presented on resources available and research that you've done, and I'll dig into it, but I'm just wondering from your experience whether you've been able to have enough experience behind you to do a sort of a high-level comparative analysis where these practices have been applied in a region and where they haven't been applied, and whether there's some broad observations that you can draw upon to just really make your case, because I think it's a powerful case that you're making, and I'm just wondering whether there's enough data out there to really reinforce it from an anecdotal point of view.
Yeah, in Merritt, I worked for BC Wildfire Service for 30 years plus, and my boss then was Tom Lacey, wildfire mitigation and fire prevention thinker, and I went to Mission for a 16-week program, in government Indigenous fire prevention technician training, and when I got out, My job was to learn about cultural burning, which my boss Tom Lacey really wanted to know more about, and so that was became my job to learn about Indigenous use of fire. And the things that we learned about fire, we applied to our initial attack program. And Tom also used it in a small town called Logan Lake, just southwest of Kamloops. And it's mostly lodgepole pine and fir mix. The spotting distance of lodgepole pine is 5 kilometers. So a 5-kilometer area around the town has been the fuel modifications through piling and burning, and a lot of that work is still going on. It doesn't stop because the forest doesn't stop. The forest keeps growing and trying to regrow through the work that we've done there. And although I'm not working there no more, but in the 2000s, we started there, and I think it was the Tremont fire actually threatened the town of Logan Lake, and was going there, and then some of our wildfire mitigation work, and also the wind direction change, helped to steer it away from there. But the firefighters had safe places to work from. So that's one of the areas where that knowledge was used, and Tom Lacey was there. Also in Merritt, BC, you could see that there's a lot of areas around the town. We built hiking trails and bike trails, and we burned inside using those hiking trails. Now the public uses those trails, horse riding and all kinds of things, to make sure that those trails are always there. But the trails aren't there just for tourism. They're there to be a fuel break for the fire. And so the fuel break, the trail, even though it's only 1.5 meters wide, that's not going to stop the fire, because like I was saying, the spotting distance is 2.5 to 5 kilometers. So it'll just spot inside the town. So the trails are outside of town, right? And then all the work is done inside. And so the Indigenous people, using fire over thousands of years, started to make the area safe around where you live first. And then once you've made the area safe where you live, and then you go and you work on your berry patches, hunting areas, medicine grounds, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a really great question too. And I realized too, yeah, it was a 20-minute like crash course in all the work that we've done over years. And I'll make I'll send to Mikey an email of all the different resources that she can send out to participants as well on where to find these different things and website links. So in terms of having evidence of, whether, the work that we want to do on the ground and has been done historically, like works in a scientific sense, I think it's really important to point out that we do have, like, our elders have stories of this all the time, but oftentimes their knowledge isn't valued the same as like Western science data. But it's really difficult for us as Indigenous people because, like, the practice was illegal, like it still is. Like, there were 2 firekeepers who were just charged in BC last year who were trying to do cultural fire. So it's very difficult, to have some sort of large scale like data analysis on an illegal practice. So that's one thing that we suffer with a bit, is because, people always want that evidence. And I think, Joe does a really good job of kind of painting a picture of the work we can do. And then we can also look to our colleagues in other places. And, although vegetation's not the same everywhere, like in the Northern Territory of Australia, they've had a extensive cultural fire program there through their fire ranger groups for the last 10 years. And there's been a lot of evidence coming out of that it significantly has reduced firefighting costs and need for fire suppression and evacuations of communities. So there, and California too, and the Crook Tribe and others have similar. And Crook Tribe just signed an agreement with CAL FIRE now that the Crook can do whatever they want in their area for burning. They don't need permission anymore. They have an agreement on notification, which is required, which I think is what Indigenous people, we want to work with agencies. We want to partner. Like, we see ourselves as a really natural ally to doing this, but we also want to bring back our fire governance structures. And one thing I hear a bunch too is, well, Indigenous people were burning and their fire got away. Like someone just went out and threw a match in their front yard to get rid of dead grass, and the fire went away. Like that's not a cultural burn. That's not following our proper governance structures about fire, where to burn, when to burn, why to burn. So I think that's one thing we really need to bring back to our own communities as well. And I mean, Joe's trying that. We're going to be working hard on the Thunderbird Collective with really accelerating capacity building.
Amy, this is Ollie, the MC here. You mentioned insurance and the idea that in Australia, sometimes insurers are some of the biggest funders of cultural burns. What's the picture like in Canada right now? What do you know about how inclined to fund something like this? How interested in this Canadian insurers are?
Well, one of the big issues that we have is that, most of the burning occurs on reserves, and many individuals on reserve don't actually have insurance or hold homeowner insurance. So it becomes sometimes that they're not that interested in us because, we're not a big money pool for them. Like a lot of people don't hold policies. But what we've really been trying to do is talk about, the landscape work that we can do that then decreases smoke and other things that other communities are impacted with. What we really see a lot of interest in now in terms of funding, I mean, we're still working on the insurance industry and I hope we'll get there, but is the carbon credits and carbon offsets and other things. So carbon has become a huge topic. In Australia, a lot of their work is funded through carbon offset programs, including the Aboriginal Carbon Fund. That's an organization there. It's very confusing in Canada how this would actually be done. Like there's no program right now you can sign up to and say, I want to do a cultural burn. Can I be funded to do it through carbon offsets? And also a lot of the carbon offset is about protecting trees, right? Where we know that meadows and grasslands and other things also store carbon. And that's really what we're trying to preserve with cultural burning as well. So a lot of education to go there. There's biodiversity credits that are becoming of interest as well to communities. There's also the whole thing with carbon offsets, like, are we just allowing polluters to pollute more, right? And so there's all these, big ethical questions as well, but we're trying to slowly work through it. But we see a really natural funding partners as wildfire management agencies, who are already spending, in some cases, billions on fire suppression to support fire guardian programs in communities.
Last call for questions from the floor.
And I do have Joe's video to show from Australia. It's 3 minutes long. I think we have a few minutes there. It didn't work in the presentation.
Sure thing. If we can go to that, let's do it.
Okay, just give me 1 second to share my screen here.
Fire is really big value for Indigenous people. Fire was used for thousands and thousands of years. It's part of a wildfire mitigation tool that can be used to improve the land.
Can you see it?
We can hear him, but we can't see him.
Oh, interesting.
Don't know what happens if you press full screen, maybe?
Yeah, I tried the full screen,
Yeah,
but
it doesn't show it.
Can you see that? No?
No.
Okay, well, we can just watch Joe in
Maybe
a little.
Joe can just stand up and mime the movements for the next 3 minutes. Maybe lip sync to it.
Big value for Indigenous people. Fire was used for thousands.
Okay, we got it now.
It's
Okay.
part of a wildfire mitigation tool that can be used to improve the land. My name is Joe Gilchrist. I've been around fire for most of my life, working with Indigenous nations to apply fire to the land and fight wildfires during the summertime. I just got back from Brisbane, Australia for a 16-day trip. We went to 4 events, did 3 presentations, met a lot of people from across Australia. Not only that, but from around the world. My favorite part was where we actually did the cultural burn. The role of cultural burning is the same there and here in Canada. I wasn't expecting a tropical rainforest. It was 30 degrees Celsius about and 80% RH. Where I'm from is dry, so if it was 30 degrees, we would have had spot fires everywhere. But I was surprised at how the fire controlled itself. It was really good to see the difference and also, the confidence of the people that everything was going to go the way that they said, fire the same language around the world. So making connections and collaboration is really important. We can find out different training methods, what's been done and what hasn't been done and what needs to be done, start to build more of a relationship across Canada and the world.
A huge thanks to Joe Gilchrist and to Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen. Thank you so much for your time both today.